So you want to own a daycare center. It's about as recession-resistant as a business gets. Parents need childcare whether the economy is booming or shrinking, tuition runs high, sometimes $1,500 a month or more per child, and demand in most cities far outstrips the number of licensed seats available. On paper, this looks like a genuinely stable business to own. Here's the number that complicates that picture. 8 of the 11 largest daycare chains in the United States are owned by private equity firms, and those investor-backed chains report profit margins of 15 to 20%, roughly double what a typical small, independently owned daycare actually earns. And it isn't because the big chains are simply better run. Researchers who mapped these chains against census data found they concentrate heavily in higher-income neighborhoods, with the household income surrounding their locations averaging well above the national median. The math only works according to their own SEC filings, when tuition stays high and staff pay stays low. By the end of this video, you'll know what it actually costs to open a daycare, why the staff-to-child ratio makes this one of the hardest businesses in America to scale profitably at a small level, why the margin gap between a mom and pop center and a national chain is so wide, and who's actually been buying up this industry over the last 2 decades. A daycare business isn't one business. It's 3, all caring for the same age groups under very different structures. Version 1, the home-based daycare. Run out of a caregiver's own house, with a smaller licensed capacity and dramatically lower overhead than a commercial facility. This is the lowest-cost way into the industry, and it's also capped in scale by both licensing rules and the physical size of a home. Version 2, the small independent center. A standalone commercial facility licensed for somewhere between 50 and 150 children, competing directly on quality, location, and price with everyone else in the neighborhood. This is the classic small business version of daycare ownership, and it's also the version most exposed to thin margins and rigid staffing costs. Version 3, the investor-backed chain location. Part of a national or regional brand, often owned by a private equity firm, benefiting from centralized purchasing, corporate and government contracts, and a deliberate real estate strategy that targets higher-income neighborhoods where tuition can be set high enough to support stronger margins. Opening a daycare center typically requires somewhere between $60,000 and $200,000 in startup capital, covering facility lease or renovation, licensing, insurance, initial staff recruitment, and educational materials and equipment. Facility setup alone, the lease, renovations, and safety measures required to meet code, commonly runs $50,000 to $150,000. Licensing and insurance add another $1,000 to $15,000, and initial staff recruitment and training can run $20,000 to $60,000 before a single child is enrolled. None of that includes the operating cash reserve needed to survive the ramp-up period. Most centers don't reach break-even occupancy, typically 60 to 75% of licensed capacity, immediately, which means months of fixed costs, rent, insurance, and a baseline staff have to be covered before enrollment and revenue catch up. Here's the structural detail that separates daycare from almost every other small business in this series. In most retail businesses, serving one more customer costs you almost nothing extra. In daycare, it's the opposite. State licensing rules mandate strict staff-to-child ratios, often one caregiver for every 3 or 4 infants, one for every 4 to 6 toddlers, and somewhat looser ratios for older preschoolers. You cannot simply enroll more children to improve your margin the way a retail store can just sell more units off the same shelf. Past a certain enrollment threshold, every additional child legally requires an additional staff member at an additional wage on the spot. That's why labor commonly consumes 50 to 80% of a daycare's total operating costs, by far the largest expense category in the business. And because that ratio is fixed by regulation rather than a business decision, a daycare owner has almost no flexibility to absorb a wage increase by simply working leaner. Every 1 percentage point rise in wages translates into roughly a 1 percentage point cut to the operating margin. For a small independent center already operating at a 5 to 15% margin, that math leaves almost no room for error. Put real numbers on this. Small, independently owned daycare centers typically run net profit margins of just 5 to 10%, sometimes stretching toward 15 to 25% for particularly well-managed operations, with successful owner-operators often earning somewhere in the $36,000 to $60,000 range annually after everything is paid. That's a real income, but a modest one given the licensing complexity, liability, and staffing headaches involved in running the business. Compare that to the 15 to 20% margins reported by the large investor-backed chains, roughly double the typical small operator's outcome, and the natural question is, what exactly are the big chains doing differently? The honest answer, according to industry researchers and the company's own public filings, isn't primarily better operational efficiency. It's who they choose to serve. Here's the part of this industry almost no first-time daycare owner fully appreciates when they're comparing their own thin margins to a national brand down the street. 8 of the 11 largest daycare chains in the country, names like Childcare, Learning Care Group, and several others, are owned by private equity firms. Bright Horizons, one more of the largest, is publicly traded but followed a similar investor-backed growth path to get there. Researchers who cross-referenced these chains' physical locations against census data found a consistent pattern. The median household income surrounding these chains' sites runs well above the national median, and only about 1 in 5 locations sits in a neighborhood with meaningfully high child poverty rates. This isn't an accident of where real estate happened to be available. It reflects a deliberate strategy, and the companies themselves are fairly candid about it in their own regulatory filings, which describe profitability as depending directly on the ability to keep raising tuition on families who can absorb it, while keeping staff compensation, that 50 to 80% of cost labor line, as low as the market will bear. Layer on top of this a growing stream of large corporate and government contracts, employer-sponsored childcare benefits, and public agency partnerships that increasingly flow toward these bigger, more established chains rather than smaller community-based centers, simply because a large employer or government agency wants a single, scalable partner rather than a patchwork of independent operators. The result is a structural advantage compounding on itself. Better locations, better access to institutional contracts, and a business model explicitly built around serving the population segment that can pay full price, none of which is available to the small independent operator competing block by block for individual, price-sensitive families. Roughly 7.5 million children attend center-based daycare on any given day in the United States, and the top 11 chains combined serve around 12% of them, a meaningful but still modest share of a highly fragmented market. Beneath that top tier sit tens of thousands of small, independently owned centers, most of them for-profit in structure, but earning margins closer to break-even than to anything resembling the chain's reported returns. Roughly 27 million American workers, 16% of the entire U.S. workforce, depend on some form of paid child care just to be able to work themselves, which is a large part of why demand in this industry rarely disappears, even as the economics for any individual small operator remain genuinely difficult. Scenario 1. An owner opens a mid-sized independent center in a solidly middle-income to upper-middle-income suburb, where most families pay full private tuition directly rather than relying heavily on capped state subsidy reimbursements. Staffing is planned tightly around the required ratios from day one, with cross-trained staff able to flex between age groups as enrollment shifts. The center reaches and holds 80 to 90% occupancy within its first 2 years through consistent local reputation and word of mouth. At a healthy end of the small operator margin range, this owner earns a genuinely solid income, not chain-level returns, but a stable, real living from a business that never runs out of local demand. Scenario 2. An owner opens a similarly sized center in a mixed-income community, deliberately choosing to accept subsidized families that a nearby private equity-backed chain declines to serve because someone in the community needs to. State subsidy reimbursement rates, capped and often slow to adjust for inflation, cover a smaller share of the true cost of care than full private tuition does. Labor costs rise with the broader market regardless, since staff can't legally be paid below minimum wage or safely be stretched past ratio limits. This center provides a genuinely essential service, but its margin sits perpetually near break-even, vulnerable to any wage increase or unexpected repair bill, precisely because it's serving the exact population the highest margin chains have structurally chosen to avoid. So the next time someone describes owning a daycare center as a simple recession-resistant small business, the recession-resistant part is genuinely true. Families will always need childcare, but the profitability part depends heavily on something that has very little to do with how well you run the center day to day, which families you're able to serve, and whether your local market lets you set tuition high enough to cover a labor cost structure that regulation, not your own management decisions, largely controls. The childcare was never really the product on its own. Who you're licensed and positioned to serve, and whether that population can absorb the full cost of care, that's the real economics of this business.